4 times. 4 people have asked me in the last 10 days this question. What do I do when I no longer feel connected to my current church or congregation? Now, of these 4 people, there are 3 different states involved. And none of these people were speaking to one another. 4 people in 10 days asked the question, what do I do when I no longer enjoy going to church? Now, the first question I had is, what kind of issues are we dealing with here? But as I talked, each one of these people were dealing with challenges that were beyond simple changes or petty disputes or disagreements. They had already prayed about this issue. They had already sought counsel with their local lay leadership or pastoral leadership at their congregation, and they still couldn't get any relief. These are the words that I heard used: confused, angry, terrified, heartbroken, scared, disappointed. These are the words these folks used. And if there are 4 in 10 days, I'm certain there are other people out there who are wondering, what can I do? What should I do? In the event that I no longer feel connected, welcome, or in theological agreement with my current congregation. I don't have all the answers. I do not pretend to have all the answers, but I have a few ideas. And I have a few questions that I asked these folks, and I jotted them down, and I just want to propose them. First and foremost, where does this feeling come from? What is it that is causing the frustration? And more often than not, something has occurred that has caused the person to have some sort of ethical or spiritual disconnection. They think one way, the church or the leadership, they go in a different direction. Sometimes people also just grow. So where does it come from? For me, I know growing up in one denomination and then moving toward another and ultimately being ordained in that denomination, the Episcopal Church, was part of my journey. So yes, often the frustration does come from growing or adopting a new way of thinking. Oftentimes, fundamentalist churches will not take a step back and evaluate their theology. And if you don't agree with it or you push the boundaries, any at all, about the inclusion of people or whatever the issue, you will get serious pushback in a way that's often cruel and merciless. Something that each of these 4 people mentioned to me was there had been recent changes in leadership. Of those 4, one was when a pastor left, associate. Another was when a senior pastor, priest, left. And the other 2 were in the absence of clergy, in the absence of spiritual, priestly, pastorally ordained leadership. The challenge for them was how the lay leadership of the congregation was leading and acting and making their decisions spiritual, liturgically, and financially. The second and likely most important question out of all of these is, are things happening or have things happened that go against the love of God embodied in the person of Jesus Christ? In other words, is there anything happening in that congregation that doesn't seem to line up with the way Jesus lived his life and freely gave love and mercy to people in need? Your answer to that question must inform your decision. Jesus has to be the guidepost if you're staying or leaving. Period. Underneath that question, I would probably put a couple of bullet points. The Episcopal Church has this beautiful thing called the Book of Common Prayer. And we have this thing in the Book of Common Prayer that we call the baptismal covenant. When we're baptized, we make this covenant with ourselves, with God, and with the congregation around us. And the priest, the pastor, would ask people quite a few questions, but the two I want to look at that speak directly to the question at hand of when to leave and if to leave a church. The last two questions, the worship leader, the priest asks, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And will you strive for justice and peace among all people, and respect the dignity of every human being? And of course, the answer to that, page 305, is I will with God's help. So we really have a couple of things there. The first one is, will you serve Christ in all people? Will you treat other people how you would treat them if they were Jesus himself? Do you sense that happening at your church? The other question, will you strive for justice and peace and respect the dignity of every human being? There's a beautiful word there, respect. I did some research on it quite a few years ago, and it's originally from the Latin respectus, derived from a verb meaning to look back at or to regard. With that in mind, let's just have fun with it. Will you look back and regard the dignity of every human being? Now, at first that sounds confusing, as if I'm looking over my shoulder back into the past. But what it really is getting at there, I think, is being able to step back and to look back over the entire situation that you're dealing with at hand. It's taking a moment to reflect and try to understand everything that's at play. Someone's background, their experiences, all of that, who they are, where they've been, how they understand life. Will you respect? Will you take a step back and look at all of those things before you make your decision or pronouncement? One of the best ways that I have learned to take an account of the people that I work with, whether it was when I was active duty military, an associate priest at a church, a priest at a church, special projects for the bishop, whatever the position has been. Here's the question. What do you think? There are people who ask that question, and there are people who do not. The people who never ask that question are the ones you do not need to be around, because they will drag you down and they will never help you grow spiritually. I've found that the people who will ask me, what do you think, are the people that I am able to work together with and ask them the same question. What do you think? I had a senior warden one time. We got so much work done because both of us would ask the other, what do you think? And it was a very healthy, kind, and loving relationship. And unfortunately, I've been on the other side of that as well, in a galaxy far, far away. It's a powerful point that Stan Lee wants to make sure that you understand. So he's decided to come out of the honey badger hole to make sure this is clear. Stan Lee says, how we treat other people, especially in times of difficulty and disagreement, is a direct reflection of our spiritual beliefs and values. Here's another. If you haven't left yet, what's keeping you there? What is it that's holding you back from leaving? I know that some of the most important things about being part of a church, a congregation, the relationships that we form. It could be years, a lifetime. And those relationships often, even through frustration, keep us at that church. The relationships, we feel like it's just too much to consider leaving the church because I'll be leaving those relationships behind. Another thing that keeps people at a church is the history. Maybe your great-grandmother and your grandmother and your mother and you and your kids and their kids were all baptized at this one church. The other thing that holds people, I think, is just guilt. They have given so much, and they're so important to the church. Talent, their time, their treasure, and they give it to the church. And then when they consider leaving, they feel guilty because can the church function without me? Is guilt holding me back from allowing my own soul to grow into a place where it should and it can? Now, you also have to remember, and I'm not going to dive into it very deep, family systems theory is always at work in congregations. How a person grew up and the family dynamics that they grew up with and in, and oftentimes through, will directly influence how they act and understand a religious organization. So part of the respect thing is being able to step back and try and understand where people are coming from. So what is it that's holding us back? It could be relationships, it can be history, it can be guilt, it can be our own family systems. If we're going to stay, we need to acknowledge, though, the reason that we're going to remain at that church. One question that each of these four people asked me was, should I just try to stay and tough it out? And my response, simply, from experience and observation, was this. Chances are that over time, you'll begin to drift away. And you won't come to as many services. You won't show up to as many events. Some of the people that you are closest to, who are extremely involved, you'll begin to drift away from them too. If you decide you just want to tough it out, here's a question you have to ask yourself. Am I okay with this never changing and all the energy that I have fighting it ultimately doing more harm than good? Because when visitors come in, they can sense if there's conflict in a congregation. And ultimately, you'll see them one time and never again. When there's peace, you can feel it too. So if you decide to stay, is the fight the best thing for the church? Hey, maybe it is in your mind. Maybe truly it is. But you have to find out. Is the fight the best thing that can happen for this church, for this congregation? God might be calling you to stay and tough it out. Only you can answer that question. It's between you and God. The final question that I proposed, what now? You've decided that it's time to leave. You sense that things are not going to change. You prayed about it. You went through the biblical process of seeking counsel, and still the love that you know should be present, and the mercy of God and the love of God and the compassion of God that's supposed to be the thing leading that congregation forward, because those exemplify Jesus. It's not happening. What now? I would say be courageous. Be very courageous, because at the end, your soul and your soul's health matters. It matters to you. It matters to God. It matters to everyone around you. And it has even perhaps eternal implications. So if you've made it up in your mind to go, to leave, to find somewhere else, go. But go with a purpose. It's not easy changing churches or finding a new spiritual home. It's difficult, and quite frankly, it's terrifying. And honestly, it's terrifying for us as clergy too. We have the same trepidation that you do, maybe even more of it. But if you decide to go, it has to be with the promise to yourself and to God that I'm leaving because I'm going to find a home where I can be spiritually fed and grow into the person that God is calling me to be. If I leave, I'm going to go and I'm going to find a home where the gifts of God in me are not simply tolerated, but celebrated. Never go where you're tolerated, always go where you're celebrated. Visit some other congregations. Sometimes you know immediately when you walk in, this is my church. I've had people say that a lot over the years. The moment I walked into fill in the blank, I knew I was home. You have to commit to find that place so you don't just drift off into obscurity. God loves you far too much to let you die spiritually. One of the advantages of moving to a different congregation is it allows you to be for a little while before you have to start doing. There's that old story about Mary and Martha. Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus. Martha is in the kitchen cooking, and she gets really frustrated at her sister because she's just sitting listening to Jesus. And then she gets frustrated at Jesus because he's not fixing that woman sitting there listening to him teach. There's a little bit of that in all of us. There's a little bit of Mary inside. There's a little bit of Martha inside. But oftentimes people who are the doers of a church, they wind up getting so deeply involved in the doing and the function that sometimes, every once in a while, in a blue moon, they have a difficulty stopping and being in the moment. Also, I'd say when looking for a church, it has to have Jesus there. How do you know it has Jesus there? Love. But here's another thing that you have to have in a church. Mercy. If everything is rigid and angry and fundamentalist in nature, there's no sliver of gray. There's no mercy. A church of Jesus, to be healthy, to be the real church in my humble opinion, must have mercy. The prophet Hosea said this, chapter 6, verse 6. God is speaking to Israel, and they have been in a battle, and this is what God says afterwards. Israel, I am delighted by mercy, not sacrifice and scapegoats. Jesus quoted this twice in the Gospel of Matthew. He says in 9:13, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I have not come to call righteous, but sinners. Well, thank God that gives all of us hope. But then he says, 3 chapters later, 12:7, if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have never condemned an innocent person or ostracized them. When you're looking for a church, make sure that you can sense mercy in that congregation. Make sure you can sense mercy in that pastor, that priest. Make sure mercy is present. Make sure it's preached about. Make sure that mercy is part of justice and social justice. A church that doesn't have mercy, well, it isn't really following Jesus. Ultimately, changing churches is difficult. It's scary. I've moved too. I have moved on from a church as a priest of my own will and volition. You've probably moved from churches yourself. I would just say this: stick with it until you find where you're called to be. It doesn't have to be the church that you thought it would be. Be open to where God calls and leads you, because it is in that place where you can be at peace and grow spiritually into a whole person through Christ. Stan Lee says that if you enjoyed the video and you would like to see more of them, subscribe to the channel and drop us a line in the comment box that is encouraging. And Stan Lee the honey badger, though, he says if you're going to be negative, you keep thoughts to yourself because the world's filled with enough negativity. My friends, remember that God loves you as you are where you are. God loves you. Stan Lee, do you have anything else to say? Rock and roll!